Hello my friends, I hope you all are having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world. I am Eddie Pride from Milk and Cookies Total War, and finally, we are going to take the plunge and begin talking about the implementation of chaos in Total War Warhammer 3. Now obviously, lots of news coming soon with the second game in the trilogy, and we will most certainly be covering that stuff when there's real tangible things to discuss, besides the addition of Giant Slayers. But for now, while we are still in the middle of this massive lull before Norska drops, I want to turn your attention to the far future. A grim, dark future in Quarter 3 of 2019, where the Chaos Dwarfs, Ogre Kingdoms, and the Demons of Chaos will finally come out to play. For a long time, the question has been raging: how will the Ruinous Powers be implemented in the third game of this Total War Warhammer saga? And it's a very interesting one, because there are so many ways to handle their inevitable arrival. They have an obscene amount of units, especially when you consider that their roster was split between warriors and demons, and as we know, their introduction into the series was just a tad bit rocky when you consider the pre-order debacle before Game 1, and how the echoes of that little issue may reverberate almost 4 years later when we're talking about the finale of this trilogy. Now when it comes to Chaos, it should be pretty obvious. They're the big bads of the setting. The number one biggest threat in the Warhammer world, the great enemy of order, and a literal force of nature that on more than one occasion has almost completely consumed the planet. By its very definition, an inhuman and incomprehensible force with many different factions, aesthetics, desires, and creatures all vying for the spotlight. And from this mayhem in the ether come the monsters of four very different deities, each with their own playstyles, units, emotions, and battlefield tactics. And while they absolutely do work together with a common goal in mind, the utter ruination of all that is good in the world, there are very distinct ideals and playstyles tied to each god and their specific units. And I want that to be represented when Game 3 finally rolls around. So right off the bat, I want to say I think the game would benefit tremendously from going all in and giving players a ton of factions to choose from. Namely, Warriors of Chaos Undivided and Demons of Chaos Undivided should be playable and separate, just like their 8th edition army books, while allowing people full access to every unit available for each. But on top of that, there should be 4 separate factions, each tied to a specific god. These 4 would combine the mortals and the demons associated with each god, with marked Chaos Warriors and Chosen, with unique stats and visuals fighting alongside demons under the same banner. The idea here is to roll the unique aesthetic and flavor of each Chaos God into a combined roster with all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses inherent in that particular playstyle. Where a Coronate roster would have Frenzy and an overwhelming focus on attack, they'd lack the mobility of Slaanesh, the spellcasting of Tzeentch, or the durability of Nurgle. Where a Nurgle roster would have high HP values and be extremely durable, they'd be slow and plodding and lack the offensive potential of Khorne, and so on and so forth. This would give players 6 factions to choose from, and really highlight the differences between the armies of the Warp, the differences that are inherent in each of these Chaos Gods, and I'm not sure Creative Assembly is going to do it. I think they might just treat Demons of Chaos and Warriors of Chaos separately, like the 8th edition army books did, and leave it like that, but I think that approach misses the mark in that mortals do indeed fight alongside demons when they're summoned into existence, and frankly, it's just logical, right? You think about it, Slaaneshi-themed units, Nurgle-themed units, would fight alongside the demons of their respective god. And I really want to see that because I think it would add a lot of flavor and replayability to the game, which I'll explain a little bit later on in this video. So, with that in mind, rather than handle this like my traditional lore, army, and tactics series in which we cover an entire Warhammer Fantasy Battle army book from the ground up, this video will focus on a specific element of the Chaotic Pantheon, a malignant presence in the Immaterium that has been steadily growing in power and influence since its inception in the Warp eons ago. I am, of course, talking about the Dark Prince Slaanesh, Chaos God of passion, excess, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, Slaanesh is the youngest and least powerful of the Dark Gods, having materialized more recently than the other powers in the Warp. Where Khorne was fed by the bloodshed of predators in the prehistoric era before even the old ones arrived, Nurgle was strengthened by the plagues that ravaged continents, and Tzeentch grew in power as change and evolution racked the bodies of countless species. Slaanesh had no chance to mature before the dawn of sentient beings, because things like love, things like excess, things like gluttony could not possibly exist without intelligent races to partake in them. But despite this slow start in a perpetual cosmic race, he is nevertheless an important player in a divine game whose favor can swing the balance of power, giving him influence disproportionate to his overall strength. Given enough time, he would eventually rival or even overtake his dark brothers, but though I say he, Slaanesh is neither male nor female, able to take any form, but preferring an androgynous youth of impossible beauty. Obviously, before everything else, Slaanesh is known and memed as the god of balls, boobs, wine, and sensuality, and rightly so. But though that absolutely does play a huge role in the lore, there is a whole lot more to Slaanesh than just getting naked and wildly humping anything that moves. As with every Chaos God, there are elements to the themes that empower them that are actually quite admirable. The fine arts, music, dance, song, poetry, and love are all closely intertwined with the Dark Prince and his followers. But it's when these things are taken to their inevitable extremes, to the edge of pain and reason, when sensation and pleasure for pleasure's sake are mixed with despair and raw emotion, that is when Slaanesh is truly powerful and truly grows in strength. And because there will never be a time when men set aside their darkest passions and their most selfish desires, a time when they cast aside the things they most crave, there is no upper bound that limits how powerful she could become. And more than anything, she is a trendsetter, a being who exists solely to push the envelope of feeling in all of its forms further and further and further. Think of the most beautiful music you've ever heard in your life, and then raise that 200 decibels and put it right next to your eardrums. Think of the best handy you've ever gotten, then add some 40 grit sandpaper and a couple screwdrivers on top of all that massage oil. Think of the best novel you've ever read, then infuse some warp dust and watch as the words literally jump off the page and tear your eyes out. Everything that ever was, or ever has been, can be pushed to the next level, made better, or worse, or both at the same time. And that is what she and all her followers are ultimately after. The thrill, the high, the exhilaration of feeling something that's never been felt before. So in a world filled with fear, where many people are looking for an escape from an absolutely terrible existence, Slaanesh can be a super nice diversion from it all, especially in the beginning of your worship of her, on the surface level, until you learn about that darkness that hides within. But of course, by that point, it's already too late. You're hooked, and there's no getting out of it. Your soul is Slaanesh's for all eternity. You can certainly empathize with why someone might want to go down that path, though, when the alternative is a daily struggle for survival against beastmen and greenskins and evil humanoid rodents and the monsters that inhabit every nook and cranny of the Warhammer world. But what should be obvious to you by this point is that Slaanesh is very different from the other gods of chaos in a myriad of ways, but perhaps one of the most important is that he holds the least sway in the north, amongst the tribes of the Norse, the Kurgan, and the Hung. As we've discussed before, these are incredibly numerous and terrifying tribesmen that number in the millions just south of the ruined Polar Gate. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? The Northmen, perhaps more than any other race in Warhammer, have no time to be writing poetry, painting, sculpting, or playing hide the zucchini in bizarre orgies that last for 15 days. They procreate, sure, but remember, it's excess and overindulgence that matters to Slaanesh, not just their run-of-the-mill, basic, vanilla stuff. Grabbing your girl and two-pump chumping it for another chance at a son isn't really going to empower the Dark Prince in any meaningful way. Now, if you grab the whole tribe, burned some incense, and turned on that Marvin Gaye, went to town on each other for a week and a half straight, that, with some kinky stuff thrown in, might get his attention. But typically speaking, that's not something they really have time for, right? When they're surrounded by monsters and other tribes of screaming barbarians who would murder them as soon as look at them. So in a lot of ways, worship of Khorne, and Nurgle especially, but even Tzeentch, are a bit more practical in the far north because they more directly aid you in your conflict with other tribes. Khorne, with his desire for war and conquering rivals, Nurgle for his blessings of strength and survivability, stripping away all pain, and Tzeentch for the knowledge to outwit and defeat your rivals, and power through magic. Being blessed by Slaanesh, obviously incredibly useful as well. Speed, martial perfection, otherworldly beauty, inhuman endurance, all those are great things. It's just that it's getting to that point for a lot of tribes that is the problem, because in the far north, they don't necessarily have the time to do all those things. But obviously there are also a lot of tribes who worship aspects of each god in equal measure without going to the sickening lengths it requires to be champions of a particular deity. So, instead of being super prevalent in the barbarians of the north, it's a lot more common for Seneshi cults to infiltrate the civilized societies of the Warhammer world. The Elves are a great example of that. In earlier editions, their cults ran rampant throughout Dark Elf culture until that was replaced by worship of Authority, goddess of pleasure, and same thing with the High Elves, a race highly attuned to sensation and obsession. It's not uncommon for their more eccentric civilians to fall under his spell. And truly, it does take a very warped mind for an elf to willingly fall to worship of Slaanesh, because they know what happens when they die. They are extremely susceptible to having their souls taken by the Dark Prince if they aren't gobbled up by the Pale Queen first. And that's something that, of course, we've talked about in a few of my other lore videos. The fact that the elves are cursed to have their souls devoured by Slaanesh when their mortal bodies perish, just as She Who Thirsts devours the souls of Eldar in 40k. In large part, due to the fact that they live such long lives and are capable of feeling much higher highs and much lower lows than pretty much any other race in the setting. In the Empire and the Southern Realms, where there are plenty of rich trading districts given to fallen into prostitution and hedonism, and basically the pursuit of anything that feels really good, cults will frequently rise up as well. And in fact, it is here, in the realms of men, that Slaanesh gathers a lot of his power. Because while they can't feel emotion quite the same way elves can, they're obviously much more susceptible to falling to chaos. And so a lot of the rich boys of the Empire will buy out some fancy cottages deep in the Drakwold or backwoods of their own province and go party their balls off, literally. And it's a very simple thing for a little Slaaneshi party to grow into a full-on raging cult with ritual sacrifice and disappearing civilians in no time at all. I mean, let's be clear. Witch hunters are dicks. They're straight up. I mean, there's no other way to say it, but they're like that for a reason. Same principle as 40k, if not quite so grimdark. Just one heretic in a haystack can turn the whole bundle bad. And in the cities of the Empire, a chaos cult can inflict some pretty serious damage out of seemingly nowhere. Slaanesh. Not even once. Remember that, kids. But while the high-end brothels and noble houses of the Empire sometimes serve as the lairs where Slaaneshi cultists practice their dark rituals, it is far to the north, in the realms of chaos, where the Dark Prince makes his kingdom. Remember that when the Old Ones Stellar warp gates at the northern and southern poles collapsed, pure chaos energy poured through the Renton reality directly from the warp. And though the Great Vortex siphons much of that energy and sends it back from whence it came, there is still plenty that makes it through, which is the only reason magic exists, the reason why mutations run rampant throughout the world, and the reason why the closer you get to the poles, the freakier everything becomes. And freaky is a pretty apt way to describe the realms of chaos, because while each god has carved out their own kingdoms there, none of it makes any sense. The borders of their empires ebb and flow like the tides, the citadels and gardens that dot the landscape warping and shifting with the wind, and the sheer insanity of it, able to drive those who look upon it mad. The Liber Malefic describes its lunacy quite well, I think, so we'll read a passage from it. As I walked through that vast and maddened landscape, I sought to record my journey. Oh, the hubris of man who tries to map the whims of gods. Each time I turn my eyes to this page, that which greets me is different to my previous viewing. Verily, it remains unchanged while my eyes are upon it, but when I close this book, the continents shift and flow, and the landmarks dance upon the page, never coming to rest in the same place twice. Slaanesh's realm is home to many legendary landmarks. The Mortar Fortress, where mortals are trapped in a never-ending cycle of pain and debauchery. The Vale of Creatures, where nature itself revolts against the unnatural beings that breed and die there. And the Six Circles of Seduction, a parody of Dante's Inferno. These circles are not only a continuous celebration of Slaanesh's needs and desires, but also his #1 defense. An intruder must pass through each of these 6 circles in turn before reaching the palace within, and it's the weakness of the intruders themselves that they must overcome, which is, as you might expect, mostly impossible. Now, at the outermost border of avidity, one might be tempted by riches beyond measure, only to find themselves slowly turning into a statue of shimmering gold. In gluttony, the greatest foods and drinks are laid out in lavish feasts as hunger racks the body, but to take a bite would doom you to eat until you literally explode. Within the circle of carnality, your deepest sensual desires are teased, only to find wicked claws and razor-sharp teeth when you are beckoned close. Paramountcy offers great power and importance, where every whim is obeyed, every army yours to command, yet the longer you stay there, the more you succumb to paranoia, as the daggers in men's smiles and poisons in every chalice consume your every thought. Vainglory is a garden, a maze of tearing briars and stabbing thorns of impossible beauty, where the pride of one who has already bested the other circles leads them further into the darkness. And last, in the circle of indolence, a seemingly peaceful realm of heavenly music and gorgeous oceans, overwhelming the senses and dragging a traveler into a deep, restful sleep from which there is no waking. Those who make it past all 6 circles are greeted by the luxurious palace of Senesh herself, which, as you might imagine, takes all the trials and tribulations you've already passed and cranks them up to 11, as you have to contend with the wits and seduction of a literal god. Not a place you want to be unless you're seeking her favor, and even then, there are better ways that don't require you to be in the presence of an all-powerful deity who can literally rip your soul out and torture it for all eternity. Now, I want to read a passage to you all here from the Tyrion and Teclis trilogy that I think demonstrates the power Senesh can hold even over the High Elves of Ulthuan. This comes right after a particular greater demon of Senesh has been freed from his prison within the Vortex and decides to pay the descendants of Anarion a visit alongside a whole bunch of corrupted cultists. There was a strong stink of magic in the air. Takalin was no mage, but like all elves, she was sensitive to the flows of magic. She could tell that something dark and awful had been done here. She pushed on into the main building, knowing already that what she would find would be terrible. The air was close and fetid. Flies buzzed everywhere, brushing against her face, getting in her long ash blonde hair, and skittering across her exposed skin. There were too many of them for this to be entirely natural. The stink of dark magic was stronger here. The old furniture was broken, and it was as if a crowd of maniacs had rushed through this place, breaking everything precious they could find. Discarded clothing, blood-soaked, lay everywhere. There were odd outlines of elven shapes imprinted on the walls. It took the train tracker long minutes to work out what had happened simply because her mind did not want to accept it. It looked like lust-maddened elves and other things had rolled in blood and excrement and had wild sex against the walls. She had heard rumors that some of the locals had been dabbling in the old rites of the Cult of Luxury, and it looked like they had gone beyond dabbling here. It looked like they had taken to summoning things using the old dark magic. Slaanesh. She deciphered another of the words crudely written on the walls, smeared in blood and feces. Her lips curled, her nose wrinkled. Slaanesh. The word was repeated again, mixed with other names and long-forgotten curses. Nakari was one of those names, an appellation almost as dreadful as that of the demon lord of forbidden pleasure. It belonged to the Keeper of Secrets responsible for the violation of Ulthuan in the Dawn Ages, a creature twice destroyed by the mighty Anarion and thought gone forever. But Nakari had returned. And that is a good time to segue into her mortal and demonic consorts, how she marks them and what characterizes them before we jump into the army roster, characters, and how they will be implemented in Total War Warhammer 3. So as we know, both Warriors of Chaos and Demons of Chaos can be pledged to the god of excess, and you might think Khorne, being the god of war and blood, and Tzeentch, the god of wisdom, would gobble up all the warriors and all the scholars and mages, leaving very little left over for Slaanesh. But as with any god in Warhammer Fantasy, there are aspects and facets to each, and so the Dark Prince still attracts great warriors and still attracts great spellcasters to his side. We're going to do a 40k reference here because it's a literally perfect example, but think of the Isfahan campaign at the outset of the Horus Heresy, and think of the difference in combat between the World Eaters and their Primarch Angren. Unflinchingly brutal and uncomplicated, just straight doom guy, rip and tear, paint the town red and get out, and then compare that to the Emperor's Children. Precise, perfect, well-drilled, focused on the movement and the excellence of the killing stroke itself. It's the exact same idea in fantasy. Slaanesh attracts the warriors who seek martial perfection and flawless combat, and the exhilaration of combat and the knowledge of besting a foe. And while they seek to perfect their own skills, most will come to revel in the cruelty of their arts, becoming masters of pain and torture in all their forms as they're driven to deeper and darker acts. And similar idea with knowledge and arcane power along the lines of Tzeentch. As we've already stated, Slaanesh is the patron god of the obsessive, and if someone becomes consumed by their own desire to learn, they're as likely to turn to her as they are to Tzeentch. Anything taken to its extreme feeds chaos, which is why they're constantly growing in power and why they are such a threat. Now, followers of Slaanesh are typically blessed with unnatural beauty or allure, so it's not that they're necessarily super hot in and of themselves. In fact, if you look at a picture of them, you might even say they're pretty disgusting to look at, because just looking at a picture, you don't get all the other elements that come alongside being in the presence of a Slaaneshi demon or a Slaaneshi chaos warrior. But in their presence, they're surrounded by this narcotic musk that smells incredible. They move seductively with gorgeous voices, and they have the charm and power to make you do things you really shouldn't be doing. Where some are chaos warriors in baroque armor, polished to a mirror sheen, others are known as the demonettes, the lesser demons who form the vanguard of the armies of the warp. Inhumanly fast, and a bizarre combination of beautiful maiden and terrifying warp spawn with crab claws and razor-sharp teeth, they can rip through an enemy formation in seconds, but like all demons, are susceptible to the very thing that allows them to materialize in the first place: magic. Speed, precision, cruelty, and an immunity to fear are the things that most often characterizes his champions. But before we jump headfirst into the army roster and the long list of unique units Slaanesh can bring to the table, let's talk about the characters, the beauties and the beasts who will be leading this faction into battle in Total War Warhammer 3. And I gotta say, Slaanesh is in a strange place, because the faction has very few playable characters in 8th edition, maybe the least in all of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, period. Unlike Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, who have Greater Demon Lords in Skarbrand, Kugath Plaguefather, and Kairos Fateweaver, there is no Keeper of Secrets Lord in the 8th edition army book. But there's a very simple way to rectify this, and we already know who it's gonna be, because the character has been explicitly mentioned multiple times throughout Game 2's campaign, and of course, I am talking about N'Kari, Greater Demon of the Dark Prince, and greatest nemesis of the Elves. He'll be the headlining Slaaneshi demon in Game 3, almost guaranteed. There is no more well-known Keeper of Secrets in the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy lore, and very few demon princes or greater demons dedicated to any god, not just Slaanesh, have made the impact he has on the Warhammer world. I've already done a very in-depth lore video on the character. I recommend you go watch that if you haven't already. But to give a quick recap, a Keeper of Secrets is essentially the most exalted of Slaanesh's followers, towering over mortals with pincers that can crush a heavily armored knight with ease, and an aura of overpowering seduction that can freeze armies in place before the spell is lifted and the full terror of the creature is unleashed. From a Total War Warhammer perspective, they'll be amongst the scariest character killers in the game. With movement speed 10 on the tabletop, there is nothing that can move faster, and weapon skill 9, alongside a hefty dose of armor piercing, as Demons of Senesh always have the AP special rule. They will absolutely munch through single entities while spreading terror wherever is needed on the line. They have access to both the lores of Slaanesh and the lore of Shadows, so I imagine they'll get 3 spells from each, and Strider, ignoring movement speed penalties over rough terrain, would make a ton of sense as well. Now, don't get me wrong, N'Kari is a terrifying character, but as is the case with pretty much any big scary demon in the setting, mostly exists to make the good guys look like badasses. It has been banished to the warp no less than 4 times, each and every time by Anarion or one of his bloodline. Twice by the Defender himself, once by Tyrion and Teclis at the Shrine of Azurion, and once by Malekith in the heart of Naggaroth. On multiple occasions, the Greater Demon has rampaged through Ulthuan, raising armies of insane cultists and teleporting across the island in lightning-quick raids to butcher and pillage before disappearing again, and it's virtually guaranteed we'll be seeing him in Total War Warhammer 3, especially given the iconic rivalry he has with the twins Tyrion and Teclis, and the fact that he met them on the Finneval Plains, the climactic battle of the war against Malekith. Very, very good chance we see him, especially given all those hints we've already gotten in Total War Warhammer 2's campaign. It's entirely possible, if CA goes the route I think they might, in giving the Demons of Chaos their own army book without doing any godline rosters whatsoever, which I really hope they don't forgo that opportunity to actually do a Chaos-specific roster for each god, then N'Kari could very easily be the only Slaaneshi demon we see. If we get a full Slaanesh faction, then that opens the door for a few other characters. What makes the whole thing especially weird is that N'Kari isn't the playable Slaaneshi demon in the 8th edition books. That honor goes solely to the Mask of Slaanesh, a hero character, the most favorite of all her demonettes, cursed to an eternity of deadly dancing in which she moves through banquet halls and battlefields the world over, cursing those who look upon her writhing form to join her in a perpetual dance that ends in horror and death. Her unnatural reflexes gives her a very high 3+ ward save, and she has an interesting choice of dances that make up her special rules. The Dance of Dreaming lowers enemy leadership, the Flesh Spasm Polka would lower weapon skill, and the Waltz of Lethargy would lower melee attack. This could function exactly like the War Dancer stances for the Wood Elves, imbuing a different effect depending on which dance you choose. Because she's a hero, not a Lord level character, and isn't a particularly famous one at that, I think it's pretty likely that CA will skip her completely. I'm of the personal opinion that if a Slaanesh faction makes it into Game 3, which I really hope it does, I'm going to keep saying that, the second Lord slot belongs to Sigvald the Magnificent, opening a slot for another Lord of Chaos Undivided. As with every single Chaos faction dedicated to a particular god, there should be a Greater Demon Lord and a Warriors of Chaos Lord, leading them into battle. For Khorne, Valkia and Skarbrand should be in the same faction. For Tzeentch, Kairos and Village, or Kairos and Agram von Horseman, and so on. We've still got 3 more videos like this to do for the other gods, so we can save all that stuff for another time. But they could throw in a curveball and go for Azazel, Prince of Damnation, as he's actually a surprisingly well fleshed out character, and I believe even playable all the way back in 5th edition. And his lore is closely tied to arguably the most important character in the entire setting, Sigmar Heldenhammer. In a novel by the same name by Graham McNeil, Azazel was described as a mortal man who sought revenge on Sigmar when his brother was killed during battle. He pretended to forgive the soon-to-be God King and swore loyalty to him, and over time began to recognize his nobility and honesty, but nevertheless, exactly 6 years after joining his camp, 6 being the sacred number of Slaanesh, sprang his betrayal and stabbed Sigmar with a poisoned blade, wounding him badly and retreating into the north where he was prophesied to become a great champion of chaos. He ascended to demonhood, becoming a mighty demon prince and the highest general of Slaanesh's army. So Azazel is a pretty big deal. Doesn't have a massive amount of appearances in the novels, but I believe does show up in the end times, and certainly does a lot of work in Sigmar's novel, because he literally stabs Sigmar's wife in the stomach when she's pregnant with a child. So, not a very nice guy, but then again, if you want to ascend to demonhood for Slaanesh, that's pretty much guaranteed. At the end of the day, it's possible we see him, but I don't think it's all that likely. So yes, I think N'Kari and Sigvald make a perfect pairing, and I really cannot stress it enough how awesome it would be to have an entire aesthetically pleasing army with purple and gold-clad Warriors of Chaos with gorgeous Baroque armor and the Mark of Slaanesh, granting them immunity to fear and terror, fighting alongside Demonettes and Hellflayers and Fiends of Senesh. And I think some people are going to argue that that's OP, combining demons and warriors into one roster, but it's not. Each god has particular weaknesses, and when you strip out the demons and marks of the other 3 chaos gods, they're left with a very clear and unique identity that obviously has strengths, but has clear-cut weaknesses as well. For Slaanesh, fast movement speed, a lot of armor piercing, made up of glass cannons all across the board, and squishy because of that. Very, very squishy. Mark of Slaanesh Chosen would be more maneuverable and would have better AP than Nurgle's Chosen, but would be less resilient to damage, and so on and so forth. CA could absolutely balance factions this way, and it would add so much flavor and variety to the game. I really want to see it. But let's go through the army roster now. Talk about the missing units from the Warriors of Chaos book, which, to be honest, when it comes to Slaanesh, aren't very many. And then we can talk about the Demons of Chaos, their battlefield tactics, and then finish up with the lore of Slaanesh and how it can be implemented in terms of magic in Total War Warhammer 3. Now, All demons are immune to fear and terror and deal magical damage in melee and from range and their special attacks if they have them. And they have high physical resistance and typically lower HP pools, making them extremely susceptible to magical attacks from an enemy, and frankly, making them kind of bad against the dwarfs, because literally every single unit in their roster deals magical damage. When you're fighting an entire faction, the Wood Elves know this very well, against the dwarfs, they have magic resistance, they can be a bit of an issue for you. And they're unstable in much the same way Vampiric Undead are. Instead of routing, they have a crumbling mechanic that will function a lot like the vampire counts in Total War Warhammer 3. In addition, all Slaanesh demons hate Khorne and everything he stands for. Remember that the Chaos Gods have two very significant rivalries. Khorne and Slaanesh hate each other, and Tzeentch and Nurgle absolutely hate each other as well. So if CA feels like getting real creative there, they could add the Demonic Alignment special rule where those rivalries are brought to the forefront, making Khornate units more expensive if fielding a Slaanesh Lord, and making it so that Khorne demons can't benefit from the leadership buffs of a Slaanesh Lord either, and vice versa. Same thing with Nurgle and Tzeentch. That'd be a pretty interesting mechanic in a Daemons of Chaos Undivided roster, where you receive the benefits of having the playstyles of each god in your army, but lack the synergy from bringing a more themed composition to the field, if that's what you decide to do. So outside the obvious additions of the Keeper of Secrets, Demon Princes will be the other generic Lord choice addition upon launch, and they are the greatest Lords of Chaos in existence, the ultimate form any mortal who follows the Dark Gods could ever hope to achieve. They must be selected as a prince of a specific god, so you can't just say, I want a Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided. That falls to Be'lakor the Dark Master, who we'll cover in another video. He definitely deserves his own lore video. But my hope is that CA actually decides to model the differences between, say, a Slaanesh or a Khornate Demon Prince, because obviously they're marked by different Chaos Gods. They're going to look very different, and I'd much rather have some visual variety as well, rather than just give them a few unique abilities and call it a day. Obviously, the gifts and mutations for one Demon Prince would be very different from another, even within a particular god, but especially amongst the different gods. So I would like to see that visual variety represented in-game as well. They can fly, although probably won't in Game 3 in Total War Warhammer in general, because half the things that are supposed to fly in this series don't for some reason. I guess because some of the animations might end up looking kind of janky. Same reason Necrosphinx, same reason Heinrich Kemmler don't fly. Same reason Malagor doesn't fly. Probably going to be the same for Demon Princes as well. And if they are dedicated to the Dark Prince, as in if they're a Slaanesh Demon Prince, they can use Lore of Slaanesh or Lore of Shadows. Now, Heralds of Slaanesh are essentially hero demonettes. They're going to be the hero choice for the Slaanesh army roster. They can be mounted on a Steed of Slaanesh, a Seeker Chariot, or an Exalted Seeker Chariot. They're a decent duelist, with armor piercing and spells from the Lore of Slaanesh or Lore of Shadows, and they kind of fill a similar role to the Lore Master of Hoeth from the High Elves. A mix of a combat and spellcasting hero that will honestly likely see a lot of play in both campaign and multiplayer because of its versatility. Anything that can deal damage pretty well in melee, that can duel enemy heroes or lords relatively well, and do a lot of spellcasting for you, a lot of cost-efficient spellcasting, is likely going to be a very common pickup in both multiplayer and campaign. And especially with those great mount choices that all give her an insane amount of maneuverability, that's some pretty nice stuff to work with right there. Now, Seekers of Slaanesh are demonic light cavalry, tied for the fastest movement speed in Warhammer. Again, movement speed 10. If there's one thing you should ever pick up from the Slaanesh army book in general, it's that everything moves at 10 speed, pretty much. And they're basically used to harry back lines and flank with their armor piercing. They'll be really squishy. They are light cavalry after all, but absolutely insane mobility, and with their poison attacks, it will be impossible to run away from them. If you get caught out, or you put a unit in a bad position with them on the field, you're going to have to live with that decision because your only option is to fight if they decide to engage. You are not going to be able to outrun them. Poison plus 10 movement speed, which could very easily equate to 95 to 100 move speed for a land unit, in Total War Warhammer 3, it's insane. It's a really good combination. Not a unit you're going to want to just charge directly head on into Grail Knights, but certainly something that you can use a lot of synergy with in terms of the other units in your roster. Get a rear charge off with them. They're going to hurt even demigryphs. They're going to put the pain on any armored unit because, again, they have a lot of AP. So Hellish Riders are essentially the same unit, but for the Warriors of Chaos. And instead of mounted Demonettes, they're essentially mounted Marauders. They do have a unique and pretty interesting special rule, though, called Soul Hunter, that based on the number of units they kill, they get additional bonuses. So Fueled by Pain is the first stage, gives them a higher charge bonus. Intoxicating Delirium is the second stage, gives them higher leadership. And then Insensible to Agony gives them 20% physical resistance on the third stage. So the more you kill, the better that unit will perform, the tankier it'll be. And believe me, you're going to want that 20% physical resistance because it is a very, very squishy unit, like most Slaanesh units are. Now, Fiends of Senesh are monstrous beasts with the same redonkulous speed of pretty much everything in the roster. They combine the tail of a gigantic scorpion with reptilian and humanoid qualities. Pretty freaky looking unit. They exude a soporific musk, the same narcotic drug that kind of follows a lot of the most important monsters and creatures in the Slaanesh roster. And that soporific musk will lower the melee attack or weapon strength of nearby enemies, and are basically just the monstrous version of Seekers. They're low model count, with a bit more punching power, they're the monstrous version, and they're less likely to die in melee. Certainly they're a bit more tanky, but they're less effective for running down light troops. I think they're going to function kind of like really fast Rat Ogres with a big AoE debuff. So not quite cavalry, not something you want to send directly into something like demigryphs, or even Grail Knights or Chaos Knights or any of the top tier cav. But with support, kind of patrolling in your back lines, I think they'll be a really, really nice choice. Now the Seeker Chariot and the Exalted Seeker Chariots of Senesh are again movement 10 units. These would literally be the fastest chariots in the entire trilogy, and they have poison attacks on top of everything else. But while the Seeker Chariot is essentially the light version, not particularly durable or heavy, the Exalted Seeker Chariot is like a demonic Combine Harvester with a massive charge bonus, representing its additional impact hits on tabletop, and a ton of killing power wrapped up into one very scary looking unit. Pretty sure you're beginning to see a theme here. Armor piercing and speed are the name of the game. You gotta go fast if you want to party with Slaanesh. Now the Hellflayer is yet another variant of Chariot, and I think it's safe to say that only 2 of the 3 will actually make it in the final game because honestly they're a little bit redundant. Even from a visual perspective, they look very similar. Originally, these lawnmowers were used to cut up dead bodies for the plants of the realms of chaos to more easily consume all that juicy organic goodness. And as it was kind of a super boring job with no payoff, only very annoying demonettes that were not in Slaanesh's good graces were sent to crew them, until a pair of very rebellious ladies defied Slaanesh and rode them onto a live battlefield rather than a dead one, and slaughtered everything in sight, and grew faster and faster and more dangerous the more people they killed. After the battle, they were punished by being frozen in marble and forced to look away from the Gilded Palace for all time, so they could no longer partake in the glories of being a follower of Slaanesh. But from that point on, Hellflayers were used on live battlefields because he recognized how powerful they were in that battle. They're exceptionally good at killing stuff. They're exceptionally good at just absolutely mowing through ranks of units, and they're basically like a chariot on steroids. They can slam through big blocks of heavily armored stuff and do a lot of damage. This unit has a special rule called Soul Scent that gives it more damage output the more units it kills, so would basically work like the Black Coach. The longer it's in melee, the more damage it's doing, the more powerful it's going to become. Now, again, still a little bit squishy, but a more heavy version of the Seeker Chariot, so you can kind of get stuck in a bit more with this one and not worry about it as much. And finally, Demonettes are kind of like Forsaken. Movement speed 6 on the tabletop, I believe. They have good weapon strength, they have big scary claws for weapons, and they will absolutely butcher lightly armored foes and run them down. They'll be a really nice core choice as your front line of Chaos Warriors are not also in the mix, but we'll see if they are when the day finally rolls around. I think in a lot of ways, Slaanesh might end up being my favorite Chaos faction to play in multiplayer, simply because of their playstyle. They're super mobile, they're super hard-hitting, but punishing to play and very squishy if you take bad engagements. And that's always been a kind of playstyle that I've gravitated towards. I really like glass cannon factions that require a lot of micromanagement, but if you control them well, they can dominate, and that's really what I like playing. So in terms of battlefield tactics, it should be pretty clear how they function. Outflank, use that mobility to quickly eliminate high-value targets, and take engagements that your opponents can't avoid or run away from, and use that obscene amount of fear and terror you have in combination with rear charges to cause routes, and then run them down before they have the chance to rally and recover. Keeper of Secrets can quickly eliminate high-value single entities and get wherever you need it to be in seconds, and you add some Chaos Warriors and Chaos Knights with the Mark of Slaanesh on top of that, differentiate them a bit further from the other Nurgle or Cornate Chaos Warriors, and you've got an incredibly cool looking and entertaining faction here. In the lore, psychological warfare, they're bread and butter, using hauntingly beautiful music, overpowering drugs, and sensual perfume to lull enemies into a false sense of security, and then you just kind of go in with the shock troops and murder everything, turn it up to 11, and unleash the full terror of the Dark Prince. Crushing claws, flensing talons, and ripping teeth, finding their enemies, and dragging them screaming into the warp. I think rights should play a pretty big role in the Daemons of Chaos campaign, as summoning particular greater demons or demon princes could be handled through that mechanic very nicely. Say you have to sacrifice a certain number of prisoners to a god of your choosing, and then you gain access to unlocking a Keeper of Secrets after I've slaughtered 10,000 prisoners to the Dark Prince. And Favor of the Dark Gods will undoubtedly play a defining role in Game 3's campaign. We don't know to what capacity just yet, but I imagine CA will take the ideas from Norska and run even further with those. But before we finish up, there is one thing I want to discuss, and that is the lore of Slaanesh. There will be 3 new lores of magic coming with the Daemons of Chaos: Lore of Tzeentch, Lore of Nurgle, and Lore of the Dark Prince. Now, Korn, obviously not a huge fan of magic, so nothing doing for Big Daddy, but when it comes to the lore of Slaanesh, there are a lot of interesting spells to choose from. Born of Damnation is the lore attribute, and it will literally replace casualties amongst your demonettes or your Fiends of Senesh if your spells cause unsaved wounds to the enemy. This could be represented as a simple health regen when casting spells, but that would be kind of boring, so I'm definitely hoping to see some Fiends or demonettes get actually replaced once they've taken some casualties in the middle of combat. The signature spell is Lash of Slaanesh. A tongue-like whip of energy erupts that slashes into the enemy ranks. It's a direct damage, armor-piercing spell that will probably end up looking pretty boring, kind of like Wrath and Ruin. You know how you kind of see those little squiggly lines appear on top of the unit, and that's the only thing that tells you that anything's actually happening to the unit, and then you might see a model drop here or there. Probably how it's going to be handled. I don't like how direct damage spells actually look in Total War Warhammer. I think CA could go a little bit further with how they differentiate those spells, but we'll see. It'd be very cool to see an actual lash out, a whip, rip through an enemy formation, but no idea if it's going to happen. Some of the spells have been really amazing, like Penumbral Pendulum. I absolutely love what CA did with it. Some of them have been kind of underwhelming, so we'll have to see. Acquiescence is a spell that I'm not sure will make it into the game. It represents a wizard overpowering his opponent's mind with broken dreams and visions of unattainable success, and the reducing enemy movement speed component of the spell, making it a snare that drastically slows down a particular unit, could definitely work, but in tabletop it also gives the target unit random movement. That part is a little bit weird. If CA found a way to program that where you use a spell and then it randomly decides to turn around and run 50 meters the other way, that would be pretty cool. Or you could simply make them rampage. That could also probably work, but although it would be absolutely busted, I have seen the idea thrown around that it could give you a 3 to 5 second period where you have control of the enemy unit. You can't attack their units with it or anything, but you could control the movement of it, make it turn around so that you can get a rear charge into it, that kind of thing. That could be super busted, probably a 0.000% chance of that happening. It would be incredibly broken. Even if it was only a one-time ability, yeah, I cannot see that actually working, but it would be really fun. I like the idea in practice. I think actually, or I like the idea of it, but in practice, it'd probably be way too much. But it'd be really fun. Anyway, there's another spell in Lore of Slaanesh called Slicing Shards. It's a direct damage spell again with armor piercing, used to clear out high model count units and hordes. For this spell, the target must pass a leadership test or take the same hit continuously until they pass the test or die horribly. One thing that CA hasn't really done is combine stuff like toughness or leadership checks into the damage spells. So direct damage just does direct damage. There's no extra element to it where it will only work if the leadership threshold is at this point, or if the toughness or their HP pool is at this point. If you put direct damage on an enemy, they're gonna get directly damaged. It's just that simple. And I expect that to remain true here. It makes it a lot more simple, makes there be a little bit less counterplay, and it's my biggest issue with spells like Fate of Buna. Obviously, the fact that you can point and click and then just kind of delete it, and there really is no counterplay to it. But from the description of it, I feel like it could very easily be transformed into a bombardment of some sort and not just be stuck as a boring old direct damage spell. So, I don't know. Phantasmagoria is another spell. Summons seductive illusions throughout the battlefield and functions as a hex that reduces enemy leadership. So, nothing really special there. Literally probably just a flat minus 16 leadership penalty in an AoE or something like that. That's probably a bit excessive. I'm trying to think what the other one, like, I can't remember what the other leadership, yeah, no, 16, Doom and Darkness I think is 16 leadership, yeah. And then, Hysterical Frenzy grants a unit frenzy, but also damages them. And finally, the last spell of the Lore of Slaanesh is Cacophonic Choir. It's a hex that deals damage over time while slowing enemies. It's a pretty balanced overall lore of magic in terms of what it's able to accomplish. There aren't many buffs there, but pretty much covers all the other bases. I guess it doesn't have a vortex either. But it focuses on hexing and damaging an enemy, but without any crazy over-the-top visual spells like Wind of Death or Purple Sun. I'm going to be pretty interested to see how CA decides to handle it from a visual perspective, because I think going into Game 3, it might look a little bit underwhelming next to some of the other lores. That the gut magic might be pretty insane to get a good look at. But I think if CA decides to go in and maybe change how direct damage functions in terms of the visual aspect of it, and from a gameplay perspective, they could do a lot with direct damage. I think if there's one element of magic that I'd really like CA to improve more on, it's direct damage. Because from a visual perspective and from a gameplay perspective, I don't think it really offers a whole lot. So I think changing that up a bit could be pretty nice heading into Game 3. We'll see. But I'd love to be surprised either way. But with that all covered now, the final question remains. How will the Realm of Chaos actually be implemented? As has been proved on countless occasions by now, CA is not going to make a separate map that only a handful of races can actually use. An underway map is definitely not coming for the Skaven, Dwarfs, and Greenskins, so a Realm of Chaos map sure as hell isn't coming for just the Demons of Chaos. Instead, I think they'll handle it a lot like how Beginning of the End Times handled it, if you played that Medieval 2 mod campaign before. The Brass Keep, a Gilded Palace, a Garden of Nurgle, and a Citadel of Change, all placed in set locations in the Chaos Wastes as the map expands northwards. And just north of Norska, that's where the Demons of Chaos will make their initial playground. And that might make for some interesting dynamics and inter-demon conflict before you move towards the Realms of Men at the beginning of your campaign. But that's it, guys. That is our first look at Slaanesh and what we might see from them in Total War Warhammer 3. Stay tuned. We're going to be doing a lot of the same kind of videos for Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, and some specific Lord videos. I think Be'lakor would definitely be one that would be interesting. And there are plenty of others that we can talk about, and if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave those in the comment section below. And of course, I'll be covering real news from Total War Warhammer 2 when there's actually something worth reporting, which I suspect will come next week based off what Grace has told us on Reddit. As always, let me know what units and features you would like most to see in Total War Warhammer 3 when the Demons of Chaos come. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Peace out.